So thank you for joining us. So the session is entitled The New Data Protection Landscape, How to Secure and Keep the Trust of Your Consumers. Just as an opening question, how do you see that the data protection landscape has actually changed over the last few years? Steve?
I think it's changed in a number of ways. I think the level of awareness, certainly amongst consumers, has risen. Whether or not that has fallen through in terms of what they're prepared to do to protect their data, of course, is a different matter. But in terms of awareness, if we're just talking about, do people know about these things, then yes, and that's down to the media and, of course, the size of a number of the breaches that have taken place. Going forward, I think certainly when we see things like the General Data Protection Regulation coming in, then a lot more power is being transferred, if you like, to the individual in terms of how they manage their own data. And I'm not sure at the moment that people fully understand that.
So Julien, from Google's perspective, what do you see, given that you're a large multinational?
Yeah, I would say more from the perspective of a large public cloud provider. Mm-hmm. Let's talk. I don't dare to talk about all of them, but Google as an example of a large public cloud provider. We see a lot of what is happening, right? We operate 7 platforms with more than 1 billion users, so a lot is happening. And we see all the great things and the bad things. So there's a lot more capability to anticipate the threats that is gathered into these systems. These systems also allow and deliver the promise to take away the complexity. I think what has really become more prevalent is it has become so complex for consumers to update their OS every time of their 10 different devices, for administrators to patch within the year, within the month, within the week, and if you don't do it within 2 weeks, now you're too late, right? So the complexity is such that it has become almost impossible for even administrators professionals to cope. So there is a second evolution. Large cloud providers in general propose that promise to take away that complexity and play a bit the role of banks, really, with your money. The problem that arises now is that gradually everybody realizes that this is a possibility, but everybody is faced with a leap of faith. Everybody realizes that to benefit from that advanced capability to anticipate, advanced technical capability to defend, you need to put your data onto somebody else's infrastructure. And I think this is a big evolution now, where the evolution of the legislation will play a very big role. Mm. Yeah.
So Mike, I mean, obviously from Experian, I mean, you're in the business of risk management. I mean, how does this affect you?
Well, what we've seen, and again, we have the benefit of the view from the U.S. in 2003, which was the advent of California's first data protection law for consumers, and now 48 states have that in the United States, and we've seen the changing landscape because of the introduction of legislation. And it's too bad that it always takes legislation for businesses to be aware of taking care of the consumer. So at least from that perspective, with GDPR coming into force a year from today, I think this is one of the first times when we've been able to see history in cybersecurity and know that the things that we saw change in the States are going to happen, and probably at a greater rate once GDPR goes into effect.
So what do you think the actual effect of GDPR is going to be? I mean, is it simply that people are going to be patching their systems more and doing the basic stuff, or do you think there's going to be a more fundamental change in the way people think about their data?
What we think or what we hope?
Yeah. Well, do you want to expand on that?
So very often we're faced with the question, how do we know we've done enough for GDPR? Mm-hmm. And my reaction when I get these questions is that if you ask yourself that kind of question, you probably aren't even where GDPR starts. Mm-hmm. The purpose of GDPR is to put the entire industry on its toes indefinitely. Mm-hmm. It is meant not to be a box that you can check and then forget about it. It is meant to force every organization to put security by default and by design in their operations. And this is a cultural shift. And so our hope as citizens, as consumers, should be that this will have the real impact that this legislation is meant to have.
Steve, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think we shouldn't underestimate the challenge of GDPR. I mean, I think that when we look at organisations, and if I just look at our membership, it's a global membership, Fortune 500, that the sheer volume of information, of data that they have to try to then categorise, and some of it's in the cloud, some of it's being stored by third parties, and so there is a whole process that they need to go through that is well above and beyond that most of them have got in place already. And so I think that what we're going to see, certainly with GDPR in the early days, is movement towards compliance, if I could put it that way. And I think that's what the regulators are looking for. They want to see movement towards it. I don't think any regulator believes that organisations are going to be able, come 18th of May next year, to turn around and say we're completely compliant. But I think that, I'm with you, I think that from a directional standpoint, from putting in place the sorts of mechanisms that we need to have to manage an increasing volume of information, of sensitive information, then we're moving in the right direction. The question for me, though, is still whether or not consumers fully understand what they have. And when I talk about consumers, I include in that small to mid-sized businesses. Because the majority, if we look just at the UK, the majority of business in the UK is not the Fortune and the Forbes. It's the SMEs. They form a very important part in the supply chain of those organisations. And therein lies the weakness for me. So when we talk about, are consumers more aware, I do tend to group them in the SME category as well, because I think the responsibilities tend to overlap, and I'm not sure that we're quite there yet.
So, Mike, I mean, I have a general observation that following major breaches, there isn't usually a mass exodus of customers from companies that have actually been breached. Why would you think that might be?
There's a short-term effect and a long-term effect, and we've done a number of white papers here in the UK. Most recently, we found that after an event, about 49% of the consumers would discourage or slow down their trading with the company, and 69% would actually stop doing business altogether with the company. We saw with the Target breach, which was a watershed moment in the United States, that their share price dropped about 25% in the quarter following the event, and there's some other examples. But over the long term, because of the switching costs, whether it's your financial institution, whether you like buying from that retailer, or you have a longer term relationship, let's say with your healthcare provider, it's very hard to go find other doctors or another financial institution. So in the long term, that recovers nicely.
So I suppose there's a sort of follow-on question. I mean, if you do consumers actually fully understand the value of their own data? I mean, Julien, given that you handle so much data from individuals through various members of your systems, presumably you have. I mean, I know you have tools to allow people to secure their accounts, multi-factor authentication and so on. What sort of proportion of people do actually use those?
So the more advanced the tools, the smaller the proportion, but the direction is clear. Consumers, organizations, we have seen really a shift in the last year or so of mainly organizations. I engage mainly with organizations, less with consumers, that have started to put security at the forefront of their negotiation. Instead of addressing this at the end together with the legal and the risk management checkboxes, this starts right at the start. First, we need to engage with the board, with the C-levels, and explain how it works. So I believe customers, would they be organizations or consumers, will increase their expectations and will start to select their providers based on what they perceive is the real quality of their defenses. Maybe I live in a bubble, but I select now my bank based on what their second step authentication method is. If it's a crappy thing from 5 years ago, I just tell my family that we go somewhere else. And I think this is going to be much more common than we think increasingly.
So, Steve, do you think there's, from a sort of more corporate perspective, do you think there are any specific takeaways that people today could take away? It's the same fluff of the day to help their businesses to prepare for sort of like the more rigorous controls that are going to be required around GDPR.
Yeah, I think for me, you have to start with what's important to you. as a business or as a consumer, doesn't really matter, right? Because that's where your focus is going to be, that's where your energy is going to be focused. So what are your mission critical assets? Start with those. The things that if they weren't available, you weren't able to access them, would cause your business to come to a grinding halt. So now you're motivated. Start with those, look at where they're held. They may be in a cloud, they may be held locally. Look at who you share that information with and ask the question of those third parties, how they're protecting that data and what happens when something goes wrong, so that you're prepared for it. Because there are two elements to this. It's about, first of all, understanding where the information is and how it's protected. Then you can move on to planning for what happens when, and it will be when, that information is lost, hacked, stolen, call it what you will, when it's no longer available to you. And those are the two stages that I think it's very important that everybody goes through. I just wanted to come back on a point, though, that Julien made. Very interesting in terms of your choice of bank.
Yeah.
A lot of organisations, a lot of people, when I talk to them about their choice of bank, and mobile banking in particular, say to me, well, why is it that mobile banking isn't as secure as it might be? And my question to them is, how long are you prepared to spend logging into your account? Mm-hmm. And the answer is, well, I don't know, 10 seconds, maybe that. I like to put my finger on it. Mm-hmm. I said, what would you do if you had a bank that could guarantee you security, but it took you up to a minute to log in? And the answer is they wouldn't be interested. Mm-hmm. So there is always this tension that organisations have to face up to between what we as consumers find acceptable versus security. And that's called risk management.
Absolutely, I'm totally with you. With an additional component, though, that it is possible with adoption of new technology to get better security with less.
Absolutely.
But
absolutely.
For the rest,
So, Mike, do you have any specific suggestions for boards to allow them to manage their sort of information risk, PII kind of risks any better?
It starts with the board. If the board doesn't have as one of their top 3 overall business strategic priorities nowadays that cybersecurity is important, and they're going to fund it not only, as we talked about on some other panels, from a technology equipment standpoint, but also place the importance on employee training and job-specific employee training and investing in that, and not only at the board level saying, yes, you should do it, but the board does it themselves. It's got to start with a culture. The company will never catch up. It'll never fail. There's always going to be breakdowns further down the line.
Thank you. There are some interesting questions appearing on Slido. So I'll go to that. First one, it's going to come up on the screen. Actually, it's more for Julien. Given the current state of privacy, cloud, US, UK sharing, GDPR and Brexit, what's the future for global cloud services? This is from Anonymous.
These ones are not.
Let's hope not.
So the arrival of GDPR and the European legislation is, the best thing that can happen really to the digitalization of Europe. Okay, so first of all, as European, we should be proud of that. This is a beacon for the rest of the world. It is going to increase security of the data, controls. It is going to increase trust, and it is already accelerating demands in our services for 2 reasons. First of all of us that are today keeping all of our lifelong savings, and I'm using a metaphor now, right, under a mattress with a shotgun in the living room, hoping we won't be stolen, realize it could be smart to put your money in the bank. Yeah. Okay, so this reasoning is starting to evolve. And the second thing is that people realize that, yes, large cloud providers do provide the technical capability to defend this money or this data very effectively. And as the legal framework matures, because this is what the GDPR is doing, is a maturation of the legal framework, the legal discussion disappears. And people realize it is absolutely legal under specific conditions to use large public cloud platform for the most sensitive information possible. I mean, specifically here in the UK, you have some of the most sensitive, ministries using cloud providers. So it is people come to that realization, and so in fact this question maybe wasn't even intended that way. Maybe it's a large cloud provider asking the question too. It is an accelerator for us.
I want to just jump on what Julien said, though, and this is a statistic from the recent white paper. 47% of all UK businesses have data for people outside of the UK. And so regardless of whether you're storing it terrestrially or storing it in the cloud, they still have that responsibility. But contrast that with the fact that only 29% of the same companies surveyed said they had formal written cybersecurity policies addressing whether it's breach response, disaster recovery, anything related to cyber, which is pretty frightening.
So, I mean, Anonymous is obviously being very prolific in asking questions, but there's a good question here. You know, the ECJ invalidated the US safe harbor because it failed to provide adequate protection for EU citizens. Is Privacy Shield any better? Will anything work with the US?
So, sorry, is it?
Yeah, you feel free.
Go ahead,
Jump in.
we'll all jump in. Yes, don't worry.
Thank you.
Don't worry. I like support. The answer, the most definite answer is to be Googled. Google Article 46 GDPR. Okay, Article 46 GDPR will give you the 6 conditions, the 6 legal mechanisms that allow you to use a large international public cloud platform as a European citizen handling European data. And there are 6 mechanisms. Privacy Shield or Safe Harbor is one of the 6. You have 5 others. The most prevalent, offered now by all large cloud providers, are called model contract clauses. Mm-hmm. All large public cloud providers offer these. And if you are signing for the model contract clauses, you are perfectly, absolutely legitimate to operate international data transfers with financial data, with healthcare data, with whatever data. There are a few fringe benefits, fringe cases. Sorry, limitation in English. Fringe cases where the European law does not apply and where the GDPR does not apply and where nation states could still impose, for data to be kept in country. Mm-hmm. The countries that have applied these kind of laws most effectively are Russia 2 years ago, China 5 months ago, and now a lot of talks about Turkey. Mm-hmm. Just to illustrate that forces that ask for data to be located in a given country rarely do this only to protect the data better. And this is true for all countries.
Okay. I would add what Julien said. Although Privacy Shield is not perfect by any means, just like GDPR, it is a work in progress, and it will evolve over time and get better. And I think that's what's important to realize. The fact that there is a focus, and quite frankly, from Safe Harbor to get to Privacy Shield, where nobody thought that it was going to happen as quickly as it did, you have to commend the European Union from getting together and saying, yeah, we will put something in place.
Mm. I think as well, from our experience with our US members, a lot of them are putting in place mechanisms to ensure that they're GDPR compliant. Mainly because when they look at the fact that Privacy Shield allows for the sharing of information, 9 times out of 10, that information, if it's PII, is going to refer to a European citizen, and so therefore the GDPR applies, and so that's why they're putting that in place. So for me, looking at the way in which, as I say, our members in the United States have moved, that they have viewed it almost as, okay, we've got Privacy Shield, that's convenient, but we still have to focus on GDPR as well. And that's the approach they've been taking.
Great point, Steve.
Perhaps we can take a question from the audience if anyone has anything specific you wish to ask. Raise your hand now. No? Okay, well, I'll go back to...
Where's Anonymous? He should
I know. I was going to see if Anonymous has been throwing something in here as well.
Should be wearing his mask. Mask.
So, all right, maybe this is one for Mike. I'll take another one from Slido here. Do the panel think a reputation for good data protection can become a positive differentiator in the marketplace for companies?
Yes. Any company that doesn't place the security and the privacy of consumers, regardless of how you're transacting, it is a way to differentiate, especially after a security incident. Again, security incidents prior to GDPR and after GDPR are still going to occur at the same rate. The difference is the reporting and the awareness by consumers that they're happening, and then also the obligation for these companies to be able to say, hey, we have to not only tell the Data Protection Authority, but we have to do something for the consumers, which arguably should have been done all along. And those companies that are already doing that and putting cybersecurity first are going to benefit from it.
This is a supplementary question. Do you think there will be an increase in things like class action lawsuits that happen, obviously more in the US than they do in Europe as a result of GDPR, as more incidents are reported and there's more sort of interest in this? And then as further to that, what difference do you think that would make in terms of boards' sort of focus on this?
From the US perspective, I get asked that question quite a bit. And real class actions, effective class actions, have only been a phenomenon in the last 2 to 3 years. So it's been at least 7 to 10 years before class actions came of age, if you will, in the U.S. after the regulation started. So I don't think immediately you're going to have this pile of attorneys and litigators coming in to do class actions in the EU.
I think the one thing that we will see is that almost miraculously there will be an increase in the number of breaches across Europe, staggeringly, because you have to report. And actually I think that will cloud the perspective initially, because we know that some of these things are happening already, you just don't need necessarily to report on it. And so we're going to see almost an artificial blip, if you like. My view on the class action is that it will come, because there's money in it.
Follow the money.
I just want to build up on what you just said. This is the reason why I believe we see such an acceleration in the demand for our services. All of a sudden, people realize, oh my God, I will have to report. The fines are very high. And all of a sudden, the leap of faith becomes an easier step to take. Yeah.
Okay. So Anonymous has been back at it again. Where can an SME go in terms of regulation, in terms of getting a regulatory body to get advice on GDPR other than the ICO? Where would Google, obviously?
Well, there's an organization. I mean, Google is actually the best place because you can find many articles, but specifically in just the last day or two in the States, an organization called Trustee, Trust with a small e, which is a compliance organization, put out a free booklet, easy to read, layman's terms. There are more of those coming out, and any major law firm will have their points of view on GDPR. So for an SME, there's plenty of resource materials.
So Steve, just a question. Does the ISF actually publish specific GDPR guidance as well, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd say, if you've forgotten our website address, then Google ISF, and you'll find, plenty there on EU GDPR. We've been working on that now for probably about the last 12 to 18 months. We're on our third iteration of research in that area, and those of you who are members in the audience will know that a lot of what we do is very practically focused. So it is about what you need to do, how can you go about doing it, not all of the information, the guidance is freely available, but there are some elements in there that people can just download. So take a look.
Yeah, I just want to add, there are plenty of this, and it's accelerating. Like the university is coming, there are events and all the time. I would just say it is worthwhile taking a step back and trying to consider this threshold as a positive evolution. I see many people go there as a big burden that they have to comply with, and I think it is, on the contrary, really an opportunity to revisit many things. And use new tools, consider new tools. And I think all large cloud providers today are positioning their offer, in a commercial way, in a way, but to say, hey, if you use these tools, they can facilitate, these building blocks can facilitate your evolution.
I think that is a good point. I mean, my perception again, and based on what we see, is that a lot of people are viewing this as a compliance-based exercise.
Yeah.
It's not.
And that is a really missed opportunity.
Yes.
It really is. Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are some that might say that in the same way that PCI DSS is a sort of like a tick box exercise, there is a danger that GDPR becomes that, and if you don't fully understand the fundamental reason why you're doing it, you're going to miss something.
And you're going to be caught.
Yeah.
You're going to be caught because it is not meant to be that. Yeah.
And you'll save money. As we found, again, you talk about PCI DSS or GDPR, and name any of them, if it's a tick box exercise and you don't actually have a plan and practice that plan and become prepared, it's going to cost you about 25% more on your response if you're responding as a security incident or as a formal data breach. We've got statistics on that.
Just want to pile up once more. I think as Europeans, we're always a bit annoyed, in a way, by the fact
Don't
that...
look at me.
I'm going to talk about America just in a second. So, but we always consider, how do these Americans always have a step ahead, and why do they? For once, that Europe comes up with something that is a beacon for the rest of the world, where the entire world is looking at Europe, saying, "Oh my God, this might be really an interesting thing." And even in America, people are looking at this as an interesting evolution. We should, really pile up and apply this and become the region of the world where technology is adopted with the most respect for and the best protection for data. Yeah.
Excellent. Are there any questions from the audience? Has that prompted anything? Is Anonymous here? No? Okay, well, there's one more question here that possibly is slightly controversial. GDPR makes EU PII a much juicier target for extortion for the most sophisticated organised criminals who are all looking at the EU. Doesn't GDPR make EU PII less safe?
Oh, sorry.
Depends how you protect it. And I think that certainly one of the things I'm going to be talking about a little bit later in my session is this storing up of juicy information in vats that are clearly highlighted as containing that. So from a cyber criminal perspective, you know where to go. And that places the onus fairly and squarely on two people. First, those that are putting the information into the vat, and secondly, the people who are responsible for the maintenance of security around that vat. And GDPR should enable those two people to talk sensibly together about what is appropriate. But you're never going to get away from the fact that we're creating huge reservoirs of data that have very useful information, and we need to be sure that they are suitably protected. The reality is, of course, they won't be.
I don't think it makes any difference in geography. I think it's back to the earlier point that the panel made is, as long as you have the availability and you have the access and it's easy to make repeatable and predictable, you'll follow the money regardless of where the geography is.
Okay. Is there any final points that the panel would like to express to...
I would like to share a finding.
Sure.
So I've realized that something works well with some audiences I engage with, some executive levels I engage with. When people are faced with this complex, confusing decision or adopting or moving to the cloud, not moving, where to put your data, it is interesting to segment your decision process in 4 different steps. The first one is to make a purely technical risk assessment. Where is my data safest from a purely technical point of view? The second is to make this same assessment from a legal point of view. What is really legally required? And as we discussed, the legal framework is maturing, and we see that there is less and less fear to have, from adopting new technology. The third one, which is really the big one still looming, is the political risk. So what is the political risk that I'm facing in Russia, in China, in Turkey, maybe in the countries I operate with, to then still be able to operate on a public cloud, I would say. And the fourth one is the cultural risk. Okay, some companies are faced with the cultural need because they have unions, because they have a heritage, because they have, and it is very valid. It's a very valid concern. So, but at least you make you take your decisions at these 4 distinct levels, and you realize that the cultural risk and the political risk do not necessarily go in the same direction as where the technical direction and the legal direction are pointing at the moment. And then you make your call. But it helps to segment rather than to have this confusing image of, oh my God, I need to have my data in the UK, and because, and then you realize it's for a cultural reason that I need to have my data in the UK. Is it really helpful from a technical point of view?
So one last thing, I'd just say take the regulation in GDPR very seriously and work as diligently as you can to get ready for it, because the last thing you want is to be the first one after the regulation goes into effect that you violate it and you get fined, because that's going to be the poster child, and it will be a lot worse than the fines.
Thank you very much. And I'm not going to say the same thing again. Thank you very much to our panel.